All right, today on The Explainer, we are diving deep into one of the most famous poems ever written, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And we're going to uncover a secret story, one that's been hiding in plain sight for, believe it or not, a whole century.
For a century now, whenever we hear these famous lines, we immediately think of one thing: World War I, right? We've always seen this poem as the great masterpiece born from the ashes of that global conflict.
I mean, it makes sense. All the critics for decades have pointed to its chaotic, fragmented style, its images of, bones and bodies, and they've linked it all directly to the trenches, to this shattered European consciousness. It was the poem of the post-war world. Case closed, or so we thought.
But what if the poem is actually haunted by a totally different ghost? I'm talking about a catastrophe that killed way more people than the war, but was somehow almost completely erased from our history. Yeah, there's this newish theory. It's called viral modernism, and it suggests that this whole masterpiece, well, it's deeply infected by something else entirely, the 1918 influenza pandemic.
And this thing was huge. We're talking about a global pandemic that was actually deadlier than the war it overshadowed. So that begs the question, right? Why is our cultural memory of this plague so faint? How can we remember the war so vividly, but we've basically forgotten the flu?
Well, the answer, it seems, lies in how we remember tragedy. Think about it. A war is a collective struggle. It's a story of heroes and sacrifice. We can build monuments to it because we're fighting a visible enemy. But a pandemic? That's a whole different story. It's this lonely internal battle that you fight by yourself against an enemy you can't even see.
Yeah, it's really hard to memorialize that kind of helplessness, A death that just feels like a private, personal tragedy, not some grand national sacrifice. There's no heroic story to tell. It's just loss. But here's the thing. Just because it was forgotten by the public doesn't mean it just vanished. Nope. It went underground. It got coded into the art of the time.
Okay, so if we want to find the pandemic's fingerprints all over this poem, where do we start looking? Well, the first place, the most obvious place, is the author himself, T.S. Eliot.
It turns out Eliot's personal letters from the very years he was writing The Wasteland are pretty much the smoking gun. He and his wife, Vivian, they both got the flu back in 1918 during that really deadly second wave, and his letters are just filled with descriptions of constant sickness, what he called a long epidemic of domestic influenza. He even talks about specific symptoms, like a new flu strain causing extreme dryness and a bitter taste in the mouth. And all of this physical and mental strain just overwhelmed him. It led to a nervous breakdown right as he was writing the poem. So you see, the virus wasn't just some abstract thing happening outside. It was literally inside his body, inside his home.
Now, once you have this biographical key, the poem's famously difficult style, it just starts to look completely different. It's less like some abstract modernist experiment and more like, like a shockingly accurate medical chart of what it feels like to have the flu.
In fact, scholars have a name for it: delirium logic. Think about the poem's structure. It just jumps all over the place, right? Fragmented voices, confusing leaps, hallucinatory images. There's no clear connection. Well, guess what? That's exactly what a brain does when it's in the grip of a high fever. So Eliot's writing isn't just fragmented, it's feverish.
Let's look at a specific example. Take this famous line. For decades, critics saw this as, a spiritual thing, a passionate fire. But if you look at it through this pandemic lens, whoa, it becomes devastatingly literal. It's the voice of a body literally burning up with fever.
Or how about this? The poem is completely obsessed with thirst. You get all these images of dryness and the sound of water that you can never quite reach. And what was a key symptom of the flu? Overwhelming dehydration. So this isn't just some metaphor for spiritual drought. No, this is the real, physical agony of dehydration. Something, remember, Eliot himself wrote about in his letters.
And then you get these really bizarre, terrifying images. Bats with baby faces crawling down a wall. I mean, what is that? For a long time, people just wrote it off as surrealist art. But now? It suddenly makes a chilling kind of sense. These are the vivid, frightening hallucinations of a patient whose fever has literally turned their world upside down.
Okay, so the poem doesn't just capture the feeling of being sick, it's also completely saturated with the two most common outcomes of the pandemic: death, and for those who survived, a kind of drained, exhausted, living death. We all know the poem is just full of dead bodies and scattered bones.
But the traditional reading says, oh, those are soldiers on a battlefield. But what if they're not? What if they are the civilian corpses that were literally flooding the cities and homes back in 1918? The reality of the time was a piling up of bodies that just completely overwhelmed society.
And just listen for a second, not to the words, but to the sounds in the poem. It's filled with the constant tolling of bells. Now, that's not the sound of war. That is the domestic sound of a city in perpetual mourning. Kind of like the constant wail of ambulance sirens that we all became so familiar with in our own time.
And this really brings us to the final crucial point. The poem's famous difficulty, its broken language, its struggle to communicate. Maybe that's not just a stylistic choice. Maybe it perfectly mirrors the profound silence that surrounded the pandemic in real life. It was a trauma so deep, so personal, that it became unspeakable. And because it was unspeakable, it was forgotten.
So reading The Wasteland through this new lens, it doesn't mean we have to throw out all the other interpretations about war and cultural collapse. Not at all. What it does is add this incredibly personal and resonant new layer of meaning, one that, especially today, we can really feel in our bones.
The poem's fragments, then, aren't just the shrapnel of war. They're the aftermath of a viral catastrophe that shattered bodies, minds, and memories. It becomes this powerful memorial to bodily suffering, a record of what a pandemic actually feels like from the inside. It translates that cost, both physical and spiritual, into a language that, honestly, after our own recent experiences, we're only now beginning to truly understand.
And this whole thing, reading this old poem in a new way, it forces us to ask a really important question about our own time. What are the invisible traumas that our artists are capturing right now that we just can't see because we're too close to them? 100 years from now, what will people find hiding in plain sight in our art? What ghosts are haunting our own wasteland?